Now, Cameroon has only known one president during the last 40 years, Paul Biya. He's Africa's second longest serving head of state. For 30 of those years, one man, John Fru Ndi, was his only credible challenger until his death in June at the age of 81.
These were young men and women, young boys and girls, armless with leaves in their hands. You bring live bullets, the live bullets to shoot and kill, and you did. Who gave the order that they should shoot and kill?
That's John Fru Ndi speaking in 2019 after protesters in his native northwest Anglophone region were dispersed by troops firing live rounds. Since 2016, a violent conflict has been raging in the northwest as separatist groups fight for their own state, claiming the marginalization of the Anglophone population. More than 6,000 people have died during that conflict. But while he consistently spoke about this marginalization, John Fru Ndi always opposed the idea of a separatist Anglophone state. So, with his funeral taking place this coming weekend, today on the podcast, I'll be discussing his legacy with both his son and an analyst, and asking where his death leaves the opposition in Cameroon. I am Mpho Lagaje, and this is Africa Daily.
Cameroon opposition is really going to struggle to find someone as courageous, as charismatic, as persistent as John Fru Ndi has been.
That's Are Ntui, a senior analyst with Crisis Group International. He is himself from Cameroon. He says it's not a simple matter talking about Fru Ndi's political legacy or even the level of support he enjoyed in his own political heartland. Fru Ndi's opposition to the separatist cause won him many enemies, and only last week his home was burned down by unknown attackers.
If you look at some of the proposals about how to resolve the conflict in the Anglophone regions, I think Fru Ndi is one of those prominent ones who stood for a return to a federal structure of the country. And given that the federalists are kind of subdued and their voices are not being heard, they are being targeted from all sides, it's likely that they have lost a very strong voice, a very strong advocate for when eventually peace talks could have begun.
Now, that's something we will discuss more later in the podcast. But before we do, I wanted to talk about Fru Ndi first with one of those who knew him best, his son Cornelius. I started by asking him if he had a particular special memory of his father.
Yeah, so, there's loads of things to which, we can say, we remember of our father. But for me, growing up as a child, it was him being a man of the people, a person who embraced numerous individuals, strangers, and opened his doors to many. So grew up in a home where 9 of us are siblings, but at any point in time in our household, we had over 40 to 50 people living in there. And that's not something, whilst most African families have got large families, you probably say maybe we've got 10 to 15, 20 people in a household in the large families. But on average, in our case, we had over 50 to 70 people at any point in time. So growing up with strangers, growing up with people we've never met before, and having an open door is something which will stick for me for a lifetime.
Wow, 40 to 50 people or up to 70. That's a lot. But please share with me a personal story or anecdote that illustrates your father's character.
So again, numerous. When I look through his biography, when I've grown through watching him, it is fearless, right? Someone who would never say no in the fiercest of moments, because growing through the multi-party environment, there were times when he had to respond to either crises, people getting arrested for various different reasons, and he wouldn't sit back and say, well, I'm not going to go in there. He would say, let's go. I'm going over to the governor's office. I'm going to speak to the Legion commander. I'm going to speak to the colonel to see why people have been arrested for various different reasons. And that is someone who, without even thinking or blinking in the moment, would always strive to respond to the crisis which he was faced at. So he would always be as selfless as that to walk over to the front line to ensure that there is justice, people are freed, and there is that equality. People are not being marginalized for a reason which they were not liable for, but he always turned up and showed up. And that's something which we look back and say, wow, what a fearless and courageous man whom we feel very, very privileged to have as a father.
And I can only imagine while fighting for the people, he also had to find a way to strike that delicate balance between his commitments as a politician and his responsibilities as a family man. How did he do it?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. It was a tough one because even when he made the time for family, we still have people turning up. And he was a man who never said no. He wouldn't shut his doors to anyone. So whether it was Christmas, it was Easter, it was birthdays, or it was the children's or special times in the family, whenever people turned up, he opened the doors for them. So we grew up knowing that, we need to be open. We need to have that ability to share and welcome anyone who come up through the doors, because that's just the kind of person whom he was. But regardless, having said that, he knew what the priorities were as a father in terms of education. I mean, for those who know, he was a bookseller before, the proprietor of a big book center. So education was one of his key areas, ensuring that it did not take second place. And so when it came to education, Christianity, going to church, he always ensured that his children, his family had that on top of the agenda. And so when it came to our results or fostering our education, he always ensured that, he gave us the relevant support which we needed to ensure we had the best chance to succeed.
Right. Now, I would like us to talk about politics. It's a cutthroat game, definitely not for the faint-hearted. I just wonder, Mr. Fru Ndi, what inspired your old man to get involved in politics?
Very interesting question. I would say he saw the need for change back in the 90s. He saw a system which wasn't delivering for its people. He was already envisaging a problem which has escalated right through 33 years on, still hasn't been solved. He saw a lot of marginalization back in the 80s, and he felt, I'm not going to sit back and watch this. Going into politics, as I mentioned, he was proprietor of a bookshop. So he had experience in terms of either servicing the different schools across the different towns, be it in the French-speaking areas or in the English-speaking areas. Prior to that, he was a president of a football club, PW de Bamenda, a club which played nationally as well. So it wasn't just something which he sat back and imagined. It's something which he had experienced throughout his travels, whether as a football club manager or as a proprietor of the bookshop. So when he explored that became to feel through to him as, all right, there is a problem here which we need to tackle. Let's get together with a think tank of members and friends at the time to begin to pull together what became the Social Democratic Front, the SDF party. But he was responding to a dire need for change where there was evidence of social injustice, there was dire evidence of marginalization, and there was dire evidence of people being not prioritized because of the language they spoke at the time and right now.
Right. So he saw the problems that existed in his country. He decided to contribute some solutions, but then running against a long-time ruler like Paul Biya is no child's play, right? It requires stamina. What kept your father going over the years, especially as it became clear that Mr. Biya wasn't prepared to give up power?
So it's a combination of two things, I would say. There are probably many, but I'll call out two things here. My father was a man of faith. He believed in God, and that was something which we all grew up every single day. He read his Bible. He would bow his head down and make a prayer every single day. So he believed that he had the blessings of Jesus. He believed that he was blessed and this was his chosen destiny. And secondly, the people. Once he launched the party, he very quickly realized that, he was not alone. There were people with him on that journey. People saw hope. He provided vision in terms of what change could look like. He provided that determination in terms of we can make this happen as a Cameroonian people, regardless of how intransigent the regime was.
We know that there have always been some violent episodes in Cameroon's political history. Were there moments your family feared for your father's safety?
Yes, no, absolutely. Many times, right? We grew during the early days. They were quite violent. I mean, the landscape has matured now. There's been better understanding in terms of what democracy means and what it stands for, and that there could be dialogue between different political parties. And so if we think about the worst case being, during the early 90s when he went in for the presidential elections, where the vote count from the independent voting booths had him as the winner, but then the results which were published said otherwise. And on the back of that, he got put under house arrest, and a number of other people who were under house arrest for over 3 months. And those were moments where we as a family, probably at the age of 8, 9, we did not understand what was going on. We were like refugees, living in different places for our own safety. So not only were we worried about would he be able to survive the house arrest, he's been shot at, our house got rained with grenades and tear gases. So with all of those episodes, you never knew whether he was going to come out alive. We never knew if we were going to come out alive. And hence why I said, there's one thing which he has carried on for over 30 years is his faith in God, because that faith in God is something which we're very, very proud and pleased to say, that saw him through despite all of the different difficult moments.
Now, your father has enemies, even in death. And this is one of those unfortunate things that come with being a politician. The family home was razed down days to his burial. It must be a terrible feeling, especially as you are still mourning his passing.
Absolutely. It's really painful because as we mourn him, we're trying to get to the closure to where how can we celebrate him rather than mourn him, because we tend to say we celebrate him because of what we've just spoken about. It could have been a different story should things have gone wrong, right? So if we think about what he's achieved so far, we're celebrating him. And so in the midst of celebrating him, there are still people who think this is an opportunity for us to score personal goals. So it is really sad to learn. We want to recognize and celebrate him for who he was, what he has done, the opportunities which he has provided, even for those who are attacking him right now, right? He stood for democracy. He stood for the voiceless. He stood for freedom of speech, which is what has given a lot of these people who are attacking him now. So they're attacking an individual whom has stood for them, but they cannot come to terms with appreciating the platform and opportunities which he has created for them. So it is almost that reality check is which we call on those individuals who feel now is the time to attack our father at his death, to reflect on what he's contributed to the Cameroonian people, what he's contributed to the Anglophone community, what he's contributed to the people of the Northwest, to reflect on, let's celebrate him and let's take our fight elsewhere where it is duly deserved.
That's Cornelius Fru Ndi, the son of Cameroon's opposition leader, John Fru Ndi, who died last month. But I wanted to hear more about his political significance in Cameroon and what his death might mean for opposition in the Central African country. So I turned again to Arain Tui of Crisis Group International.
He led the Social Democratic Front, Cameroon's main opposition party, until the last presidential election in 2018. He's been Bia's most credible challenger, but towards the end of his life, at least over the past 7 years, his popularity dropped significantly, and he actually died in Yaoundé out of his home Bamenda due to a conflict between Anglophone rebels and the government forces in Yaoundé. But over the last 30 years, he is very clearly Cameroon's main opposition leader. His death is certainly a big loss for the country, for the SDF especially, which is simply falling apart. And it's very likely that the Cameroon opposition is really going to struggle to find someone as courageous, as charismatic, as persistent as John Fru Ndi has been.
What do you think is going through Mr. Paul Bia's mind right now, considering that Mr. John Fru Ndi, as you say, was once a credible political threat to him?
I'm not too sure President Bia would be terribly bothered about the demise of Fru Ndi politically. But symbolically, it's concerning because despite Fru Ndi's opposition to a lot of Mr. Bia's policy, he tended to agree with him very strongly that the country needs to be kept united as a united country. And just as Mr. Bia, the rest of the government, he opposed the separatists who wanted to form a separate country, an independent country from the former British Southern Cameroons. So symbolically, for the president. That would be a loss because that's important intellectual, moral support coming from a very influential, very powerful, highly regarded Anglophone leader.
What impact might this have on the conflict in the Anglophone regions? And I'm asking because we've seen what happened in recent days with Mr. Fru Ndi's family home being attacked.
These developments illustrate a number of things. Firstly, the state of insecurity in many parts of the Anglophone region. You'd imagine for such an important figure, someone who has been praised for his patriotism, his focus on keeping the country united, his love for peace, he can't even get security around his home. Sort of illustrates the dire situation that ordinary Anglophones and residents of Northwest and Southwest regions are facing. But also politically, it sort of means that there is a vacuum. There is no forum for dialogue, for example. The political parties are mostly inactive or silent regarding this conflict. Though Fru Ndi has passed on, it's hard to see what he could have done more. In the early days of the Anglophone uprising, the peaceful protest, 2016, 2017, Fru Ndi was actually active, got his party to get involved in some of the protest marches, and also protested within parliament. But even with that, they weren't given a listening ear. There's since been no debate on the Anglophone crisis at the level of the national parliament. So perhaps a continuous stalemate is what we are left with. But if you look at some of the offerings, some of the proposals which have come over the years about how to resolve the conflict in the Anglophone regions, I think Fru Ndi is one of those prominent ones who stood for a return to a federal structure of the country. And given that the federalists are kind of subdued and their voices are not being heard, they are being targeted from all sides, it's likely that they have lost a very strong voice, a very strong advocate for when eventually peace talks could have gone. Figures like John Fru Ndi could come along and say what they believe in, maybe a return to a federation, maybe to look at other options and try to get a compromise. But that figure is now missing, so there's a huge vacuum there.
Paul Biya has been in power for over 40 years, and opposition parties in Cameroon remain in disarray. What does this mean for the political landscape in Cameroon moving forward?
This actually demonstrates that there is a need for a more credible opposition party. Currently, they are in significant levels of disarray, and this just simply comforts the position of the ruling CPDM party, which maybe doesn't need to worry too much about challengers, but has to look inside itself to see how the contest to succeed Mr. Biya is going to play out whenever that position becomes open. So in a sense, because of the weakness of the opposition, CPDM party members are tending to look inside and to draw schemes how to contest and fight politically against each other to position themselves. There is maybe an expectation that somehow, in view of the 2025 presidential election and several other elections which are scheduled to hold that year, perhaps a new political figure might emerge, or perhaps Professor Maurice Kamto or Cabral Libi were active candidates in the last presidential election, or even the SDF's own Joshua Osei might revive themselves with new energy and with new charisma to be able to sway again interest in Cameroon around the opposition. But apart from that, all this comforts the position of the ruling